Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our live economic policy panel discussion. My name is Tim Phillips from the Centre for Economic Policy Research. I'm going to be moderating today for the next 2 hours. Yes, we are here for 2 hours, so I hope you've got a comfy chair and some snacks in, but it won't seem like 2 hours because look at the panel that we have for you. We are going to be talking today about the inequality effects of COVID-19, how you pay for the effects of the COVID-19 crisis, I suppose you could call it. And so we have 2 presentations of papers. In a moment, we're going to be hearing from Stefanie Stantcheva of Harvard about the evidence of COVID-19's impact on inequality, or more precisely, inequalities, what policy can do about that. So I'll just introduce you first of all, Stefanie. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Also presenting the paper will be Gabriel Zucman from Berkeley, and he has a new proposal for sharing the burden of paying for this global pandemic. So he's very much on the how to pay for it side. Gabriel, you're welcome as well.
Hello.
Now, after they present them, we are going to be having comments. First of all, from Rana Foroohar, who's an associate editor at the Financial Times. Rana, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Rana, I do also recognize you from my time watching Netflix over the past year. From Capital in the 21st Century, you were in that, weren't you?
I was. We've all spent a lot of time with Netflix.
We have as well. And in fact, now I come to think of it, Gabriel, you were in that one as well.
That's true, yes.
Yeah. So with such an experienced cast, I'm expecting at least 80% from Rotten Tomatoes for this one, I guess, as well. And our second commenter today is going to be Ngaire Woods, the Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Ngaire, welcome as well.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Now, our timings today are for the paper presentations, 25 minutes each. Our commenters, we've allocated 10 minutes each. That leaves plenty of time for all of you who are watching today to ask questions and give comments. Now, I imagine for those of you who are watching this as a Zoom webinar, then you're all pretty familiar with the interface by now. But anyway, just in case, the Q&A button is down at the bottom there. Click on that, post your comment or ask your question, and I'll be checking that all the way through. Now, what I would say about this one piece of advice is don't leave it to the end. There's that temptation to hold back and not ask your question until you've heard absolutely everything. Well, what happens then is that I get a flood of questions in the last 15 minutes. I'm talking from experience here, and I can't ask them all. If you stick it in early, then the other people can go there, can upvote your comment, it comes to the top, and if it's still fresh when we get to questions, it probably will be, then I know which questions people most want me to put to the group. So that's all from me for the moment. I'll be back later for some questions, but first of all, I'd like to introduce Stefanie to talk about inequalities in the times of a pandemic. Stefanie.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sharing my slides here. It's a pleasure to be here. This paper is very much a summary of where we stand in terms of understanding the inequality impacts of COVID as of now, with the data we have so far, and then looking at some policy recommendations about the medium and longer term. So rather than the short-run emergency responses, which hopefully are already behind us or getting to an end, it's really about looking forward and what to do about these inequalities. So COVID has really exacerbated existing inequalities. There have been longstanding fractures in Western economies that have been just deepened by this crisis and put into sharp relief. So these inequalities are across income groups, sectors, regions, across genders, across children from different backgrounds. And they very much interact and amplify each other. And so the policy responses, which I will look at here, are understandably a bit ambitious and medium and longer term, because these are very long-standing and deep fractures. And so if we start from first documenting what we know so far, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what researchers have found for several countries along all these dimensions of inequality. Obviously, as we have better and better data in the months ahead or in the years ahead, we may get a more accurate picture. But it's been remarkable how quickly actually researchers have been able to jump on this important topic and study things almost in real time using either administrative data or credit card spending data, real business data. It's been really remarkable. And so let me start by documenting the key impacts on inequalities, which again, were pre-existing but have been widened. So the first inequality is simply across the income distribution. So the evidence is very much consistent across all countries that the direct impact of the pandemic before governments did anything was quite negative on the lower income households. And it has actually widened pre-tax inequality significantly. You can measure this by the Gini coefficient, which increased significantly, so for instance, in EU countries, also in the US. But post-government support, which has been relatively strong in many countries, incomes have been propped up. And so actually post transfers, the situation looks much better. Yet when we think of the longer run impact that this will have, what's really relevant to think about is sort of the pre-tax and pre-transfer impacts, which have the potential to require long-term action and have long-lasting consequences. So if we think of possible channels like job loss, unemployment, leading to scarring and persistence, business destruction, which is not, costless to rebuild and recreate. And then also in general, a trend towards digitization and automation that has been accelerated by the pandemic and that actually favors typically higher income people. So if we look at some graphs here from the evolution of household income, you can see this similar pattern in all countries where if we compare GDP versus household income, you can see a big drop in GDP, that's the red lines, in 2020 relative to many previous years, a very sharp drop. But in many countries, household incomes have been propped up as governments have been able to spend more, finance through debt in the short run. And in some countries, in fact, household income has been even been increasing during that time. But you see this very clear gap between the blue and the red lines between household incomes and GDP in those countries. If we look at the loss of income from employment between basically the second quarter of 2019 and the second quarter of 2020 across three big income groups, broadly defined: lower income, medium income, higher income, you can again see a very consistent picture across all countries. The levels are very different, but the relationship between these three groups is very consistent. In most countries, low incomes have the largest fall in incomes from employment, followed by medium and then high income. And the blue in the middle here is the EU average. And then finally, to illustrate this point that government intervention has been quite critical, this graph here shows you the sort of average income loss before any government intervention, and then the blue dot shows you where we are post-government intervention. And so you can see that in many countries, there's been a real effect of government intervention in reducing the income loss. The big thing that was prevalent and that's been quite different during the pandemic has been the shift to remote work. And actually remote work has been a bit of a vector of inequality as well. So the potential for remote work is quite lower at the bottom of the income distribution. So again, researchers in various countries have estimated what share of jobs can be done remotely. And the estimates for the US are that on average, 37% of jobs have some potential to be done remotely. But in practice, it turns out that around 46% of higher income employees were actually working remotely, and only 18% of lower income employees. Numbers are not that dissimilar for the EU. This is, again, just potential of being able to work remotely. Again, a big gap between the top and the lower incomes. In addition, even conditional being able to work from home, the productivity impacts were quite different. Some jobs were just much more easily done remotely. And that, again, is quite correlated with income. And as we think about the longer standing consequences of this, if this is a more permanent or longer standing shift, maybe not all the way, but maybe a few days per week or a general shift in that direction overall, this has implications for who can do these jobs and who's going to be rewarded more for doing these jobs. Unemployment has been also incredibly unequally distributed across incomes. And there have been actually two countervailing forces. On the one hand, lower income people tend to be in more essential positions that should normally prop up employment during this crisis. At the same time, as we just discussed, they're also less able to work remotely, which goes the other way. And so in balance, actually, unemployment shocks have been much more pronounced at the lower end of the income distribution than at the higher end. So many more high earners have been able to maintain their job, and the unemployment increases have been much smaller at the top. In addition, many of these employment effects actually were recouped relatively rapidly towards the top of the income distribution, but not at all towards the bottom. When we talk about a sort of K-shaped recovery, that's what we mean, that towards the lower part of the income distribution, things just don't recover, in fact, may keep declining, while at the top they have recovered. And again, as economists, we typically think that unemployment is rarely innocuous. It's rarely, unless it's very short term and isolated, it's rarely an innocuous thing. It typically has longer lasting effects, and we worry about those. It's impossible to talk about the unequal impacts without talking about what you could call the digital divide, which is that as many things moved online and as technology use was really necessary, we witnessed a very unequal potential to use technology. So right now we're all on Zoom. We presumably, many of us have good internet and a computer to work with, but those are not a given at all. In fact, researchers have documented very large disparities in access to high speed or even proper speed internet connection and sufficient and appropriate equipment. Think of it as all members of the household suddenly have to either learn online or work online, and the demands that this causes, especially in a time when actually incomes are also, compressed. And so these investments in potentially quite expensive infrastructure become even harder. And so there's been a very big gap in what lifestyles people can maintain, actually. First, how they're able to work, but also for children, as we'll cover in a few slides, the learning opportunities and simply maintaining, a social life or online services, etc. It's also something that feeds into another type of inequality. So if we zoom away from across the income distribution and look at by sector and regions, those are very interlinked because sectors tend to be, concentrated in certain regions. There's been many, many changes there too. But again, it's not something radically new. There have been many divergences across sectors and regions for a long time. But COVID has really amplified those. And so the major sectoral inequalities have been driven really by three factors. One is the ability of sectors to stay open during lockdowns. The second is their ability to substitute online for in-person activity. And the third is whether they were providing critical services during the pandemic or not. So there's been radically different experiences across sectors. In the US, for instance, the leisure, hospitality sectors or retail and transportation have seen a lot of decline in revenue. On the other hand, there's been a surge in health-related sectors, pharmaceuticals in particular, with a surge in VC investments, for instance, as well as IT companies. We're all on Zoom right now, and that's been obviously a booming sector. And in part because of these sectoral inequalities, and because sectors tend to be concentrated in regions have fared incredibly differently as well. And not just in terms of work, but also in terms of mortality. So in many countries, the poorer regions have been very much hit by COVID. Mortality rates are consistently higher, and people have mapped this back to infrastructure differences, ability to socially distance based on sectoral composition and the unequal potential for remote work, and also just the hospital and healthcare infrastructure. And when we think about the longer run consequences, again, it's actually not exactly clear how a move towards remote work could actually reshape regions. There's been talk of the appearance of Zoom towns, where people would basically live potentially far away from where a company is actually located and simply do the work remotely. But there's other configurations one can imagine from these temporary shifts that could lead to long-term changes. And so just to illustrate here, it's actually quite striking. If we look at the share of jobs across European countries that can be done remotely, and we separate by rural areas, towns and semi-dense areas, and then cities or metropolitan urban areas, you can see that there's a very large gap in most countries. There's much higher potential to do these jobs remotely in cities than it is in rural areas. Moving on across another type of inequality, which is by gender, there's been the term she-cession coined by researchers and policymakers, to signify that unlike previous crises, it seems that conditional on all else, women, and perhaps in particular mothers, were hardest hit by this pandemic. So the research shows that women have experienced, more work from home conditional on remaining employed, in part because they're in occupations that can be done remotely more easily, but also because of the increased need for childcare due to school and kindergarten closures. Women have also experienced much stronger reductions in work hours and actually increases in unemployment. So if we look at just briefly this figure here that shows the difference between women and men's unemployment increases, this is for the US for all recessions since 1948. It's typically been the case that men's unemployment has been much more sensitive to recessions. So when the gap here is in blue, it means that men's unemployment has risen by more. In other recessions, it's been very equally split between men and women. There hasn't been a marked difference. But in the 2020 COVID recession, women's unemployment, at a peak year had risen by, almost 3 percentage points more than men's unemployment. And so, this can be explained in part by the fact that women tend to be more represented in part-time or alternative work arrangements, which are typically the less stable ones and the first ones to go, while firms tend to protect the more, standard or full-time work arrangements. And in addition, women themselves may have quit their jobs, as research indicates, or significantly reduced their hours due to the increased need for childcare. And so the increased childcare responsibilities have been very much, unequally split. The evidence, for instance, for the UK suggests that women added, a whopping 30 additional hours of childcare per week. Men obviously added quite a bit too, but less than women did. Okay, and so that brings us to the sort of final inequality dimension, which is the one which has a gigantic potential to leave long-lasting consequences because it is about children and young people. And so these are the inequalities in education. So first, there's been a decline in general in the time spent learning for most children. So that's based typically on survey evidence of how children spend their time or students spend their time. And so especially in the early months when online learning was not yet organized, there was a significant decline in schoolwork time. But then even once online learning was organized, there's been a very strong heterogeneity by family income. So learning delays were much more pronounced for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And one way to see this is to look at the very unequal technical and resource constraints. I already alluded to it when I spoke about the digital divide for adults. Well, it's very striking for children as well. Children at home have very different technical capacities for actually learning remotely. And so that year has been experienced incredibly differently for children from different backgrounds. So this was a very fast summary of the many inequalities, serious inequalities exacerbated by COVID. If you have time to look at the paper, there are a lot of numbers. We try to actually take the literature and summarize it in a structured way in tables, comparing, for instance, in a comparable way, the numbers from different countries along different dimensions, also explaining the methodology of the papers. So hopefully this can give an overview in a much more detailed way than I can do here of what's different across countries, what do we know with certainty, what's more uncertain. But there's plenty of details there for each of these issues. And there's a quite large appendix summarizing in much more detail what researchers have done. So hopefully that is useful. Given that summary, what can be done? So I'll be relatively quick here too, but happy to take many questions in the Q&A time. The ideas here are really nothing new. They're drawing on a body of work done by me and other researchers. And they're trying to think about what to do in the medium and longer term about these really long-standing and deepened inequalities. And so if we look at policy interventions through the lens of a useful framework, we can think about policy as intervening at various stages of the economy or at different levels in the income distribution. So I found that this is a very useful way to view policy intervention. And this is based on work that I've done with Danny Roderick at the Kennedy School to think about a policy matrix to organize policy action. And so this matrix, basically, the rows tell you, where do we intervene, at which income segment? Do we worry a lot about the bottom incomes, middle class, or top incomes? And then at what stage do we intervene? You can think here of having a sort of pre-production, pre-labor market stage. Those will be things concerning education, vocational training, adult training programs. And when you think of top incomes, even things that level the playing field, like inheritance and estate taxes. So these are policies that shape the endowments and the skills and human capital that we bring to the labor market. Then is the actual production stage, which is, think of it as the labor market, but it includes firms and employees. And so these are interventions to try to improve what's happening in the labor market, whether on regulation, like the minimum wage, or what you may call regional industrial policies, innovation policies, business incentives, etc. And then comes the post-production stage, if you want, that's ex post policies once incomes have been realized. So those are our typical social insurance programs like unemployment insurance, our progressive taxes and transfers, and all these ex post redistributions that we do. And while traditional welfare states typically rely a lot on the first and third pillar, there's more and more evidence that the middle pillar, the production stage itself, may be perpetuating a lot of inequalities, and that it may perhaps be more efficient to intervene at the three stages rather than letting the middle act on its own and then try to make up for it by ex post redistributing. And COVID, I think, coming on top of the secular trends like globalization and technological change, has shown that in the labor market, there's very vast inequalities, and those can be perpetuated. And so with this sort of framework in mind, some of the proposals are on these, on each of these three pillars. So on pillar one, really, one of the major interventions is to think deeper about how to tax the transfers that happen between generations. So inheritance, estate, gifts, taxations, those are all about those intergenerational transfers. And they all have some promise to reduce the persistence of wealth across generations, in addition to raising revenue that will be needed. At the moment, they're very unpopular taxes. And I've done some survey work to show that it's in part due to people's misunderstandings of who actually bears them, the burden of these taxes and how they actually work. And a proposal that's been already, proposed by Tony Atkinson and is sort of done in Ireland is to move to a regime that's actually based on the beneficiary. So whatever you get through your life, regardless of who, regardless of when, will get added up and we'll keep track of the total you receive so that the system can be made progressive in the cumulative amount someone gets. It's quite different from what's currently the case, because currently most systems are actually depend on, who's the donor, when's the timing, and they're relatively myopic between different transfers. So transfers are treated, if you want, death by death rather than person by person who's getting the transfers. And, I explain in more detail in the paper how this could actually first allow for a large exemption of the middle class, actually, and proper progressivity, and perhaps address some of the current concerns of citizens that it's unfair, that there's a lot of double taxation, etc. Obviously, a second big intervention is on the education policy side. And here, in a nutshell, it's not just about spending more. Europe actually spends a lot on public education, but it's really about targeting public investments better towards disadvantaged areas, schools, and children. In many European countries, there's still very deep inequalities. The examples I gave from COVID are just part of it, but they're longstanding ones. And a sort of general idea is that some public investment can try to level the playing field by substituting to some extent for missing family inputs. in the sense of things that children from disadvantaged families don't have access to, whether it's in terms of time spent on help, extracurricular activities, extra tutoring, etc. And that will go hand in hand with having to equalize at least a bit access to digital resources, whether it's through the school or even better, subsidies for equipment at home for these children. During the pandemic, there were actually very promising interventions tried out involving online and remote tutoring. I'll list some examples here. Even pre-COVID, there were good online examples of things done to help children, whether it's in South Korea, in the US, or in the UK. And an example from France is this program called Doing Homework, which gives children extra supervision in school when they don't get the help at home to sit and do homework and get extra help. And then down the road, of course, a major problem is how to insert people into the labor market better. And here there's some ideas in the paper about how vocational and dual track systems and better guidance is done in various countries to try and more efficiently direct people into higher education tracks and then ultimately into the labor market. On the gender disparities, it's a quite complicated issue, like all the others, in the sense that penalties for children have been documented very much before COVID, and the solution has not been found. But there's actually quite mixed evidence on simply expanding maternal leave, as in for mothers only, on their labor force participation and earning. So if that is the goal, and every country has different goals, but if that is the goal, it seems that more promise comes from sort of earmarked parental leave, where every parent may have to take some of it. So there's promising research done by many people in the field that shows that this is perhaps a way to go if the goal again is to increase mothers' earnings and labor force participation and equalize it with fathers. On pillar 2, there's plenty to be proposed. And again, the paper goes into a lot more detail, but the things that can be done is first a sort of improved version of active labor market policies. So active labor market policies are, things like skill training, job search assistance, etc. They have a sometimes good, but sometimes mixed track record. And one inspiration can come from what's called sectoral training programs in the US, which are have been evaluated a lot and shown repeatedly to be quite successful. And those are actually programs that work much more closely with local employers so that they're targeting the local needs. They target not just occupation-specific skills, but also soft skills. And they really follow workers once they get a job as well. And they work with employers even on designing the curriculum, etc. And they seem to have very good effects, not just on employment, also on wages, on the duration of employment, etc. So that can serve perhaps as one example of what could be improved here with closer cooperation with employers. The second, big intervention is that business incentives that we do today, which take the form of subsidies for physical investment and new technologies, seem to have a pretty high cost per job created, and if the goal is to actually create sort of good jobs, it may not be the most direct way. And suggestions here, mainly done by Tim Bartik at the Upjohn Institute, who studied these for many years, is that they can be much better targeted to areas that are both distressed and sectors that have the potential to create jobs. And that tax incentives, like for instance, tax breaks for companies, should not be the only or main tool. In fact, it should come as a sort of bundle of services provided to firms, business services, infrastructure, local amenities, and coupled with this skill training through these sectoral training programs that I just alluded to. I will skip straight to pillar 3, which is sort of the ex post redistribution. And here the goal is really how to raise better, more efficient tax revenue, which will be deeply needed. And I will just end with these 3 broad points, 3 directions with which we can improve things. One is to really keep pushing this exchange of information that's been launched for several years and tax cooperation internationally. And that's both on the capital side, where major improvements have been done through the automatic exchange of information and gives a renewed opportunity to actually tax capital more efficiently and improve compliance. But also on labor, on people. High-skilled people actually tend to be also very mobile. And currently Europe has still a lot of schemes which are preferential tax scheme for foreigners, which are really beggar thy neighbor policies and which are not great for the set of countries as a whole, even though they may be unilaterally beneficial in the short run. So exchange of information and tax cooperation is one. The second big thing is that there's quite a bit of opportunities to reduce fiscal leakages by reducing avoidance and evasion, and that comes in 3 acts. One is expand third-party reporting to the extent possible, and for instance, Larry Summers and Natasha Sarin have suggested that banks actually could act very much more like third parties for private businesses and partnerships to actually report income flows that are going on and improve compliance. Leveraging data analytics is very key. So there's been such advances in academia, but also in policymaking, in predictive algorithms, machine learning, and AI, and lots more data available. This can actually be really leveraged to reduce non-compliance. And then third, to give actually resources to tax enforcement. In many countries, tax administrations have outdated technology infrastructure and would benefit from a lot more investment in software and hardware, and then also much more staff training in all these analytical capacities. And then the final thing is actually probably going to be addressed much more by Gabriel, but it's about the potential for revenue on corporate and multinational taxation specifically. And all I'm going to say here is that it's not just a revenue need. It turns out it's also very much a fairness concern, because what I see in the survey work that I do is that people tend to feel like companies actually benefit a lot when there's a crisis from government help, government bailouts in the extreme cases, yet fail perhaps to pay sufficiently into a common pool when times are good. And so thinking about how to improve the multinational taxation, specifically corporate taxation more generally, seems to be a very big and challenging with big revenue potential area. So this is what I'll end on, and I'll be very happy to take questions during the Q&A, as well as talk about a method to perhaps understand better how citizens think and design policies, which is large-scale online surveys and experiments. So I'll end here, but thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Stefanie. And I could really recommend the paper. Is extremely clear as a way of explaining what's happening in a very complicated problem. And you have been asking where you can get hold of the paper. So I've got good news for you. If you go to the economic policy website, which is economic-policy.org, on the front page, scroll down to the bottom, and there are 2 articles, one about each of these papers. And in those articles, there is a link so you can download the paper and have a look at it. It's especially good if you've ever complained that a policy paper has 40 pages of equations and 2 paragraphs of policy. These are not those type of papers at all. Stefanie, also, if anyone wants to get a hold of your slides, is that possible?
Absolutely, I'll post them online. Yes.
Great, thank you very much. And so there will be plenty of time to ask your questions. Thank you, so many good questions already. Really enjoying that. Careful what you wish for, Tim, when you ask people to ask a lot of questions. We've got loads to get through. So we better crack on. And I'd like to invite Gabriel to present his paper. Gabriel, welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to have the chance to present this work today, which is joint work with Emmanuel Saez. And this is about a wealth tax on corporations' stock. And so as Stefanie just reminded us, governments worldwide have reacted very swiftly to the COVID crisis with ambitious measures to support families and businesses, and household disposable income has increased as a result of this. The result is that more than a year after the start of the pandemic, we have a robust discussion about the various ways of sharing the cost of the COVID-19 crisis. A number of strategies have been proposed. Things like a one-off wealth tax, a more progressive income tax, more value-added taxes, non-fiscal tools like debt renegotiations, and so on. And what we do in this paper is we propose something new, a new instrument which we think can usefully complement the other measures that have been envisioned until now. And so what is this new proposal? It's very simple. We propose to institute a new tax on the market value of corporations' stock shares for all publicly listed companies that are headquartered in G20 countries. So very concretely, each listed company would have to pay 0.2%, doesn't seem like a big tax, 0.2% of their year-end market value each year in taxes. And the Securities and Exchange Commission in each country, for instance, the SEC in the US and other countries have similar bodies, could easily collect this tax. They are already in charge of supervising the creation and the transaction of equities, and they already collect taxes, small fees for this. And so it would be relatively straightforward to implement. Now, what's the motivation for this proposal, for this idea? We think it's an idea that's particularly adapted to the immediate post-COVID world. And the reason for that is because the pandemic has reinforced two key trends of the pre-coronavirus economy. Number one is the rise in top-end wealth concentration, which is a process that you observe globally, stronger in some countries than in others, but a global phenomenon since the 1980s. And second is the rise of business concentration. These things have been reinforced by the crisis. Very simply, during lockdowns, brick and mortar stores were closed. At the same time, Amazon sales exploded, cloud computing increased, Facebook traffic soared. And so we are today in a situation where a number of giant businesses have benefited quite a lot from the pandemic, and their shareholders have become significantly wealthier. And so it makes sense, perhaps, to ask the main winners from the pandemic to contribute to paying for some of its costs. The other thing I want to mention is that a tax on the market value of listed corporations that we propose in this paper would also contribute to addressing kind of broader issues, longer term issues that predate the pandemic. And to be very clear, what has happened over the last decades is we've had a race to the bottom with corporate income taxation. Large multinational companies have seen their taxes fall. And I think it raises a big problem. The problem is the following. If globalization means ever lower taxes for its main winners, multinational companies and their shareholders, and at the same time, higher taxes for those who do not benefit much from globalization or sometimes suffer from it, small businesses or retirees or low-wage workers, then I think we all agree that this process is not sustainable, neither economically nor politically. So, this trend of declining corporate taxation fundamentally undermines the sustainability of globalization. And so we think it's urgent to try to find new ways to reconcile globalization with tax progressivity, with tax justice, which I think is totally doable, but it's important to demonstrate concretely how this can be done. And so I view this proposal as part of this broader agenda of trying to show how we can actually have a form of globalization where the main winners from globalization actually pay a bit more in taxes, perhaps, instead of paying less and less. Okay, so just to illustrate what has happened to wealth concentration over the last decades and during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is the wealth of the top 400 wealthiest Americans. forget about the top 1%. This is very much 2009, Occupy Wall Street. Today, what's happening is very much the conversation increasing is about billionaires or mega billionaires. Here, the top 400 richest Americans, that's roughly speaking the top 0.00025% richest Americans. And what this graph shows is their wealth as estimated by Forbes magazine relative to the size of the US economy, relative to output, GDP. So in 1982, the first year of the Forbes ranking, the 400 richest Americans could, own 2 to 3%, the equivalent of 2 to 3% of GDP in wealth. What does it mean? It means that with their wealth, they could buy they could buy 2 to 3% of the annual output of the US. Today, the top 400 richest Americans own the equivalent of 18% of US GDP in wealth. They can buy the equivalent of almost a fifth of everything that's produced, all the goods and services that are produced in a given year in the US. They could buy this, with their wealth, just 400 individuals. And there's been a marked increase during the COVID-19 pandemic, as you can see on this graph. And the second trend that I wanted to illustrate is perhaps even more spectacular. It's the collapse in corporate income taxation. So this is showing, again, the United States, which is perhaps an extreme case, but also an important and an interesting one. There's been a trend towards declining corporate income taxation globally. It's been particularly extreme in the US, but look at the figure. This is showing federal corporate income tax revenues collected in the US as a percent of US national income, and for comparison, showing individual income tax revenues as a fraction of US national income. Now, what's very striking is that in the 1950s, the corporate income tax generated about as much revenue as at some point as the individual income tax, 6-7% of US national income. And then you've had, individual income tax revenues have kind of stabilized, but corporate income tax revenues have collapsed due to a number of reasons, the rise of tax avoidance, the rise of tax competition, profit shifting to tax havens, various tax breaks, given to that reduce the base of corporate profits. Of course, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which reduced the federal income tax rate from 35 to 21%, which explains the drop in 2018. And the result is that today the federal corporate income tax generates just 1% of national income in revenue. It's been divided by a factor of 5 to 6 over the last 7 decades. So the question is, how can we kind of maybe change this trend a little bit? How can we increase concretely the taxation of corporations? And there are ongoing discussions, and I'll get back to that, and very important international negotiations to fix the corporate income tax, to introduce a global minimum tax on multinational profits. And this is very important. And here we're proposing an instrument that would very much complement this effort. So instead of taxing income, we propose to tax wealth. And the logic is, I think it's pretty strong. So basically, you have two types of corporations. You have corporations that make a lot of profits today, but don't necessarily have a super high market value for all sorts of reasons. And you also have corporations that have a very high market value, despite making not small or even zero profit today. The textbook example would be a company like Tesla today, or a company like Amazon just a few years ago. More than $1 trillion in market capitalization, but zero profit. And so, even if you had a perfect income tax, you would not generate any tax revenue by taxing these firms. But with a tax based on wealth, you can make these companies start paying taxes sooner. And so what we propose what we describe in the paper is just a modest wealth tax of 0.2% a year. And so it's worth thinking about, what would be the economic effects of such a tax. And to start with, it's important to put this tax in perspective. It's important to remember that mutual funds charge fees today based on asset values. These fees have tended to decline because of the rise of exchange-traded funds and companies like, Vanguard, with low-cost index funds. But despite that, these fees are still equivalent to about 0.5% today. So there's already a de facto, private wealth tax, which is that, just for wealth management, financial intermediaries collect a fee of 0.5% a year. So, compared to that fee, the tax we propose is significantly smaller than that, 0.2%. The way to think about the economic effects of such a tax is that obviously it would reduce the annual rate of return on listed equity by 0.2% a year. Now, if you think that this is going to very quickly capitalize into stock market prices, into equity prices, if this happened, then at the time that this policy is enacted, the price of listed corporation stock would fall by 5%. That's how a 0.2% annual tax, capitalizes. So, okay, that's one thing. The other thing is, obviously, if the tax is just on listed businesses and listed corporations, it creates incentives for firms to remain private. And it's relatively easy to address that issue. You can simply tax large private businesses, just like listed businesses. And the way you could do that, and that's a very important component of the reform that we propose, is just like for listed firms, you could allow private firms to pay the tax in kind. So what does it mean? What characterizes a corporation is that the ownership is divisible in shares, so that when there is a tax like that of 0.2% on stocks, companies can always pay the tax in kind by issuing new shares, by increasing the number of shares by 0.2%. And so listed companies that are liquidity constraints for some reason could always issue 0.2% in shares and use that to pay the tax. And similarly, private businesses could be asked to do exactly the same. And what this means is that such a tax has no effect on liquidity. Even cash-constrained firms can always pay such a tax by issuing shares, which implies that such a tax has no reason to affect business operations. So we think it's a nice feature of having a tax on equity wealth, because equity wealth is divisible, you can always easily pay in kind. Now, if we think for a second about the revenue potential of such a tax, it's really simple to estimate based on the market capitalization of G20 countries. This market capitalization ranges from 50% of GDP in countries like Germany to 150% of GDP in the United States, which means that if you have a 0.2% tax on this market capitalization, the tax would raise something like in a range of 0.1% to 0.3% of GDP in revenue in each G20 country. From the perspective of the G20 as a whole, for the G20 overall, the tax would raise about 0.2% of the G20 GDP. G20 countries' GDP as a whole is is close to $100 trillion today, around $90 trillion. So 0.2% of 90 trillion, that's $180 billion in annual revenue just from taxing listed corporations in the G20. And to put that number in perspective, it is very, very similar to the existing estimates of how much governments lose in revenue globally because of the shifting of corporate profits to tax havens. There's been a lot of research conducted in this area, and the estimates that exist is that overall, globally, close to 40% of multinational profits are shifted to tax havens each year, and the revenue cost for the world as a whole is, around $200 billion. So one way to think of this tax is that, it would make big corporations pay the taxes that they avoid today by recording their profits in places like Bermuda or in the Cayman Islands. Another way to put this tax in perspective is to look at the nature of wealth today and what is being taxed and what is not being taxed. And so this is a graph that shows the evolution of private wealth in the United States and the composition of private wealth in the United States. Private wealth is the wealth of households plus nonprofit organizations, like foundations or university endowments. But think of this as essentially household wealth. And the graph shows household wealth in the or private wealth in the US as a fraction of US GDP and the various components of private wealth. And so there are a number of striking things to notice here. One is that total private wealth in the US has doubled relative to annual output, so relative to GDP, since 1975. So in 1975, total private wealth in the US was 250% of US GDP. So the US had accumulated the equivalent of 2.5 years of wealth, of 2.5 years of GDP in wealth. And today in 2020, and see the uptick, the last dot is 2020, in the COVID crisis. Today in 2020, the wealth to GDP ratio was 530%, so double the 1975 level. So at a basic level, what this just means is that taxing wealth can generate a large and growing amount of revenue relative to the annual flow of income and output. There's just a very dynamic potential tax base here. And second, of course, we already tax some of that tax base. A big fraction of it is housing. It's, about a third of total US private wealth is housing. And there's already a wealth tax in the US, just like there are wealth taxes in most other countries. Property taxes is the form of wealth taxation that we currently have. And we are taxing the form of wealth which is the most equally distributed. That means that the forms of wealth that are the most concentrated are tax exempt. And this is, one of the problems that our proposal tries to address. So we are saying, look, why only tax housing, this form of wealth, which is the most democratic? It's far from perfectly democratic, obviously, but this form of wealth, which is the most broadly shared, that's the only form of wealth that we're taxing. We could very easily tax listed equities, which are much more concentrated than housing wealth. And you can see, number three, that listed equities, although historically they accounted for a relatively small fraction of total private wealth in a country like the US, today account for a very large fraction of total US private wealth. So there's a large tax base here. Just to put numbers on this, housing wealth now is about 35% of total US wealth, and listed equities, including equities owned through broad-based pension funds, plus equities directly owned by households, now account for about 30% of the total wealth of US households. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about progressivity. Since equity ownership is highly concentrated, even when you take into account, again, ownership through broad-based pension funds, this tax on the market value of listed corporations would be progressive. It would be, it would also, not only would it be progressive, but it would increase the progressivity of the current tax system. As I already mentioned, it's much more progressive than the current form of wealth taxation, property taxes that we have today. But of course, it would be less progressive than a well-enforced progressive individual tax on wealth with graduated rates that could potentially increase and be pretty high for billionaires, let's say. Here, it's just a flat tax of 0.2% on one form of wealth. So it's not the most progressive tax possible, but it would increase the progressivity of the tax system. One way to see that is with this graph here, which just shows, again, in the US context where we have good data on the joint distribution of wealth and income. This is contrasting the share of income earned by the top 1% and the share of equity wealth owned by the top 1% highest income earners. So in both cases, it's the same top 1%. We're looking at the top 1% Americans with the highest income. They earn close to 20% of total US income because the US tax system, all taxes included, is a kind of a giant flat tax. When you take into account federal, state, and local taxes, the top 1% barely has a slightly higher effective tax rate than the rest of the population, but not significantly higher. So because of that, the top 1% pays about 20%, 23% of total taxes in the US. But now, if you had a tax on equity wealth and on the market value of listed corporations, about 35% of that tax would be paid by the top 1%, which just means that not only the tax would be progressive, but it would increase the progressivity of the current tax system. It would be even more true in other countries where there is a smaller fraction. In other G20 countries where typically a smaller fraction of equity wealth is owned through pension funds. If you look at the graph here in the 1950s, 1960s, equity wealth was more concentrated than today because almost all equities were directly owned, and this was before the rise of pension funds. And so for countries today that don't have a big pension fund industry, the concentration of equity ownership is likely to be closer to what you had in the US in those post-World War II decades. So the tax will be even more progressive in many G20 countries. Okay, let me end with talking about the concrete ways to implement this and how countries could agree to such a tax and what could be done if there was no agreement. So obviously, like always with tax issues and international tax issues, the ideal situation would be an international agreement. And you don't need all countries to sign and to start taxing corporations, but simply an agreement among G20 countries would be already amazing. 90%, more than 90% of the global stock market capitalization is in G20 countries. And so if G20 countries agree to implement such a tax, you're taxing 90% of the world's listed corporations. In many ways, this is easier than fixing the corporate income tax. Fixing the corporate income tax, and I've done a lot of work on this, raises very, somewhat complicated issues. How do you measure income, for one thing, it's not the same across countries. Now, here, it's very simple. The year-end market value of listed equities, it's straightforward to observe. And so I think if we can reach an agreement on the corporate income tax, it should be even simpler, even easier to reach an agreement about such a tax on corporations' stock. So I'm actually quite optimistic and quite excited about this idea. I think it has potential. We are seeing renewed appetite in the United States, certainly compared to the previous administration, for international cooperation and for international agreements of this kind. And you have, on top of that, ongoing existing discussions at the level of the OECD. And so, there is I think a political will to make progress on these issues. Now, let me just conclude with two elements. One is what to do with the revenues. And there are, in the paper, we're very open. We discuss various options. There are lots of ways to use the revenues from such a tax. One way would be just to say each country keeps the revenue that its Securities Commission collects. That's one thing. But you could also envision more ambitious proposals with some sharing of the revenues. For instance, you could imagine that the revenues could be apportioned across countries, all the wealth countries, based, for instance, on population. So in effect, allocating a significant fraction of the revenues to the global south, to developing countries. And the logic is quite strong. These multinational companies that are super valuable, and so that would account for the bulk of the revenues. They're present, most of them globally. They are successful because they can benefit from a global marketplace. But you can also use the revenues to fund, global public goods, a global sovereign wealth funds, a global sovereign wealth fund, or to tackle issues like climate change. So that's for the revenue. Let me end with what could be done if there's no international agreement for some reason. Can a country do it on its own? And the answer is yes. It's very easy to do unilaterally. The way to do this is like just like for the corporate income tax, is to say, well, look, a country, let's take, I don't know, Germany, for instance. Let's say Germany wants to have this tax, and so it taxes its own listed companies. And on top of that, it could say, well, foreign corporations that are not subject to this tax, but that have sales customers in Germany, they should also pay some of the tax in Germany. So the idea would be to apportion the market capitalization of foreign untaxed companies based on the fraction of sales made in Germany. So if a company makes 10% of its global sales in Germany, Germany consider that 10% of its market capitalization originates from Germany and would tax this company based on this. So I'll end here. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Gabriel. But and there is, just before we move on, there's just one thing I wanted to clarify on this, because it's come up a couple of times in the questions. The 0.2% figure, there's no technical reason behind the 0.2. It's sort of estimated as plugging that tax leakage gap that you talked about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You could envision higher rates. It's a modest rate, which we think is a realistic objective for such a tax in the short run, and at the same time it generates significant revenue. But yeah, it could be 0.5. It could be less.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's move on now to for Rana, please, for your response to what you've heard so far.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Gabriel and Stefanie. Fascinating presentations, and interestingly, you all are both sort of addressing different sides of the same coin, which I find quite fascinating. Just to start with Gabriel's proposal, I think I love it because in some parts it addresses the sort of larger 30 or 40 year question of who have been the biggest beneficiaries of neoliberal laissez-faire capitalism that has been largest corporations. And it also reminds me, when I wrote my first book about financialization, I was looking for the most Kafkaesque example of how perverse the financial markets have become in the sense of not serving the real economy. And the best example I found was Apple, which was a company that had not needed to raise money for operating expenses since the early 1990s, and yet was using the monetary policy of low rates, which was, of course, designed to try and help the real economy, but ended up helping equity markets by allowing these giant corporations to borrow as much money as possible, pay it back in share options, and jack up their share prices, which is one reason that we have the slide about the tax base that Gabriel showed, which I think is really, really telling. And I will be using at some point in a column, I can already tell you. And so addressing that, I think, is really important. I will say one thing, and this is a question I would love to tease out in the question time. This hadn't occurred to me when I read the paper, but Gabriel, when you were speaking, I was thinking this is such a great way to address the Wall Street, Main Street divide, but where would there be perverse incentives possibly for governments to institute policies to keep that process of financialization going in order to keep markets high enough to, take that higher tax from equity prices? I think that's a really interesting question. But the other thing that I really like about this is that one reason there is such an incredible divide still in share prices versus unemployment after this crisis, which, I frankly can't believe we haven't had a major correction yet. There's a couple reasons for that. One is, don't fight the Fed, don't fight central bankers and the trillions of dollars that they've put into the markets. But the other is the value of intangibles as a percentage of corporate wealth. And I really like that both of you are kind of getting at that question with your different proposals. There's all kinds of reasons why companies with a higher level of intangibles are, amongst the best performers. Post-COVID, if you look at the businesses that are surviving, they are, of course, digital businesses. In the US, it's quite interesting because since COVID, the number of applications for new businesses is up about 20%, but most of those businesses are digital, which is great for the people starting them. But in terms of overall job creation, that's also associated with jobless recovery. So if you look post-financial crisis between 2007 and 2009, you had a big jump in the percentage of capital investment into intangibles by companies. And that was associated with a slower recovery because, you're investing in software, you're investing in automation, you're investing in things that are not necessarily going to create vast numbers of jobs. Same again this time. Actually, a couple of experts I've spoken to recently say they're expecting that percentage of investment into intangibles to double. So again, I think that speaks really to the need to capture some of that wealth and that's reflected in the share price, but also to Stefanie's point about that huge digital divide and that huge divide in outcomes, depending on whether you are a knowledge worker like all of us or someone who's working with their hands, with their hearts in the real economy. As we all know from decades of research, the missing link there is education and remooring technology and education. And in the US in particular, that link was broken in the 1970s. So that's one of the reasons I'm quite a big fan at the moment of the portion of the Biden program that invests in care, that invests in training, that invests in bolstering healthcare, childcare infrastructures, which is such an important part of bridging the gender divide in COVID, in really addressing the kind of infrastructure that matters going forward. Not that our crumbling bridges and roads don't matter, but if we think about where good jobs are going to be, it's going to be so important to have that investment and to have that fiscal stimulus. I think that overall, to me, it seems that these proposals are very much vectorally in line with the Biden administration's work, not wealth mantra. It's really what we're trying to accomplish right now in the US is a large retooling of the economy from something that is highly financialized, highly debt driven, very much based on asset bubbles and asset wealth versus income, to just the opposite. And so in both cases, I think that these proposals would make significant contributions there. So I could go on and talk maybe a little bit about some of the challenges of the digital labor market, but why don't I leave that there for the moment and turn it over, and we can talk more during question time.
Yeah, I hope we will about that. And I do note your question about that, and also about the perverse incentives as well. Maybe we can discuss that. Thank you very much, Rana. And so finally to Ngaire for your response to what we've heard today.
Yes, hi. Well, look, first, thanks hugely to Stefanie and Gabriel. These are two really, really important papers. And I guess the first thing I just want to kind of walk through is just to really step back and think about why. I mean, if Stefanie's paper says one thing to me, it says that there are huge parts of our economies that are not coiled like a spring, as Andy Haldane at the Bank of England would put it, ready to leap forward into fast growth, but rather coiled like vipers, ready to kind of kill off parts of our population unless we take actions pretty fast. And if there's one thing that stands out about Gabriel's paper, it's what he's really, what this is a solution to, the changing structure of our economies, the concentration of wealth, of market share, and coming out of COVID, the monopolization of lots of sectors of our economies, and on the decline in taxation of corporate profits over time, right? So something is wrong. I want to step back and say, the problem, as these, two brilliant economists understand, is actually much, much bigger than a retweaking and a rebalancing of the economy. The military leadership of UK, US are readily telling us, and EU, are readily telling us that the security threats that our countries face are not so much Russian nuclear submarines, it's Russian troll farms feeding fake news into our democracies and poisoning them from within. It's not so much a Russian invasion over Germany's border, it's the fact that German alt-right violent extremists have infiltrated Germany's security establishments. And the question for us is, how do we respond to this, right? How do we respond to a threat which has become existential and sits immediately behind the COVID threat? And the response that economists and political economists have been making for the last 20 years has been, we need to manage globalization a little better, we need to make it more inclusive, we need incremental measures which somehow tweak the system and persuade our populations to stay with it. And now we have, I think, a huge opportunity to do something much bolder. And these papers, I think, help move in a bold direction, because we're in a warlike situation in the following sense. The pandemic costs so much to contain and fight it, and it's going to cost so much to build back afterwards. So this isn't a fiscal squeeze. This isn't a kind of moment of austerity like after the financial crisis. This is new territory. And the answers that, as economists, public policy analysts, that we need to come up with have to be as transformational as the messages that are being used to destroy democracies from within. And that's a huge challenge. So within that, a couple of points that I would really underscore in the papers that we've seen. So Stefanie's point about, she's highlighting the limits of current solutions. We've had 2 decades of people talking about how we should face this political crisis by upskilling the current working population. And Stefanie, I think you're saying, look, we've got to step back and think cradle to grave about opportunity. And the last time the United States and the United Kingdom and most Europeans did that was in the 1940s and 50s. You point out that all of our countries are still using tax incentives for job creation, whereas actually it's investments in specific public services, the zoning, the infrastructure policies, the local amenities, but also the public spaces that are going to be, that are going to help us shift the paradigm. And I guess there's one last thing I want to say about presentations before I close, but Gabriel, as I think you're aware, the proposal you've put in front of us is just fabulously simple. You know, and that is a huge strength for it. The devil lies in where to collect and how and where to distribute. And that to me is the issue that needs picking up by everybody and taking forward. In other words, how do we stop this issue being relegated to the G20 or multilaterals, where it will simply get bogged down in a 10-year debate because the relative stock market capitalization of each of the G20 members is well disproportionate to the sizes of their economy and the size of the multinational activity in each of those countries. That's problem number one. And problem number two for me, or it's not problem number two, but the way I would frame the question is, and I like the way you finish, what's the minimum you would need to get this underway? And would it not be, for example, as a European initiative for EU-wide? And of course, there we've got the problem that the stock market cap of companies listed in the EU is far smaller than those on the US stock exchanges. But still, I think you'd have to start with it in a region like that. I think much as we would all like to imagine that the G20 is an easy place to get agreement that will actually be implemented, I think all the evidence tells us that it's not. My final point is this. The one thing that both of these papers share is a depiction of governments is a depiction of companies as things that governments do things to. So governments in each story use incentives, regulation, and legislation, and companies maximize within those borders. I think we actually have to break out of that in two ways. And one is precisely because of where we are, we have to think about government capability in a different way, more judo than karate. It's got to be more thinking about how can governments use the very power of the private sector against it in a way, to countervail it, because government has far too little resource, capability, knowledge, information about the largest companies in the world to enter into hand-to-hand combat. So I think there's a kind of, the way I would frame the question is focus on what the minimum action that government needs to take to provoke a kind of self-enforcing equilibrium among companies themselves. And that the second is to really think about where it is that joint action can work. We tend to think that the relationship between government and companies has to be one of rent seeking, of lobbying, of corruption. And, you know, there's plenty of evidence for all of those things existing. But there are actually some really good cases of where joint action, which has specific mutually agreed goals, specific timelines, and delivers, can really work. You know, we're watching in Britain at the moment the vaccine task force example of where you put government in the driving seat, but you bring private sector expertise and private sector capability in. And I think we do have to think about that with a careful eye to avoiding rent-seeking, you know, corruption and capture by the big companies that Gabriel's paper highlights. That's all from me.
It's quite a lot from both of you. Thank you very much for that. I just want to give our two presenters the chance to respond to the response, and particularly in two areas. The first one, as we're talking about, we have almost this twin track economy between those sort of the digital economy, that digital transition, which is increasing inequality in some ways, and has also produced those superstar companies that we often think about when we're thinking about the sort of companies that Gabriel talks about. And secondly, how to be bold in this without getting into this position where government is fighting the firms within the economy over what they want to do in policy terms. Stefanie, what would you like to comment on in that?
First of all, thank you so much, Ngaire and Rana, for the great comments and very generous comments. I think your summary was spot on the challenges and main things that at least I tried to emphasize. And to your question about the interaction between governments and firms, I think what comes out for those who will read the paper, I hope it came out in the presentation as well, but it was just a few slides there, is that there's a path for, rather than conflict, actual cooperation, because there is a lot of mutual gain actually here. So, companies benefit a lot from having public services, a skilled workforce, local amenities, etc. And in exchange, communities and the economy benefits from having productive companies that create good jobs and employment. And so it could be, and in many places it is actually a virtuous cycle that can be propped up, created, fostered. So that's sort of the direction in which I was trying to go here.
And Gabriel, what do you think you can do about the sort of policies that you're advocating here to avoid getting into that oppositional posture with firms in the economy?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for so many great comments. I think there's, we need to explain why the current form of globalization, if it means less and less taxes for multinationals and their shareholders, I think is going to, not be sustainable and so it's not, I'm not saying government should have an, confrontational approach. That's absolutely not my point. My point is, if you want to, keep making profits, and you want to, keep getting access to global markets, and you want globalization to continue, and you want the market economy to thrive, you have to realize that you have to pay more. Those of you who are benefiting the most from these current processes, you have to pay a bit more in taxes. And that's always how economists have talked about globalization for decades. They've always said, look, globalization is going to create winners and losers. We're aware of that. But the government, with the tax and transfer system, can always intervene and tax the winners a little bit more. And look, what has happened is the opposite of this. This is a serious problem, and this is not sustainable. And the proposal we're making is just a way to say, look, we could do differently. The form of globalization that we've had since the 1980s is just one among many possible forms of globalization. We've had a form of globalization characterized by tax competition, a great deal of financial opacity, a major lack of international cooperation and coordination on key issues, including fiscal issues. These were choices that were made, not perhaps very consciously or in a very democratic manner, but these are the choices that have been made since the 1980s. And now we can start making other choices, have a different form of globalization that will just work better for everybody, including these very corporations that might find it outrageous to have to pay a 0.2% tax on the market value of their stock. That's what I would say.
Okay, I want to ask all four of you about the issue of feasibility on this. For example, Jean-Claude here is asking, is the global wealth tax feasible? That for Stefanie, many of these policies that you outline in your policy matrix, whenever they come up, they are fought against very hard by people who consider they have an interest in it. And we've recently seen a huge battle over the minimum wage in the US, for example. So out of all of this, out of all these interesting ideas that we've had today, where do you think the ones that are most feasible are? Stefanie, if you want to start that one.
I actually had many more ideas which are not in the paper because they were not
feasible.
They were perhaps not feasible. So I feel like there's already a selection here of policies which are doable, and of course they need to get to garner support, and that will look very different in different countries. But many of them are actually win-win policies, in the sense that if you look at them in just isolation, at that specific tax, that specific intervention, yes, there will be winners and losers there. But if you view the system a bit as a whole, and the fact that, as I mentioned before, companies contribute to society in a given way, but then they also benefit from having better services. If you view this more holistically, there's actually a win-win thing to be had for many agents in the economy. And many of the proposals actually go in the direction of, it's truly difficult to separate efficiency from equity here, actually, in the sense that there's policies which are not creating a conflict between sort of growth and actually equality. If anything, too much inequality can be hurting things, not just in terms of bad spillovers it will have on society, on politics. Think of populism, think of the opioid crisis, social breakdowns, etc. But also because when there's a lot of inequality in skills and opportunities, etc., good things don't trickle down. So for instance, good technologies remain bottled up in a few great firms, but don't really benefit many people. And so there's actually an argument for sort of the growth agendas and the social agendas to be much closer together. And I feel like all these policies go in that direction, which should improve their feasibility, in the sense that taking a step back, we should all see that we can benefit a lot as a society from these.
Rana and Ngaire, I'm going to ask you about this now. What do you think, from your experience, could be feasible in all of this? Rana, you first.
So I think it's all about positioning. And on Stefanie's proposal, I mean, the obvious way to position this, and I think the administration is already starting to do this, is let's look at where the jobs are going to be. And all these trends, as we know, COVID is almost just like a scrim that's been pulled up to show things that were already happening that we thought we had 15 years to deal with, and now we have sort of 2 to 5 years to deal with. And one of those in many developed countries is this shift from old line manufacturing jobs as a sort of a driver of middle class income to service jobs, and in particular care jobs, which of course demographic trends are fueling that, technological trends are fueling that. These are the jobs that are going to be non-automated, but they could also be jobs that would release tremendous amount of productivity in the other areas of the economy. And obviously, when you have better childcare, you release female productivity at the sort of higher end of the socioeconomic spectrum, as well as creating, if it's there's proper training and subsidies, creating higher quality jobs at the lower end of the sociological spectrum. Healthcare is another huge area, but I think that there's a fascinating way in which this investment into human capital could also sort of take the place of investment into capital. I mean, if you look at the US tax code, there's still there are subsidies given for depreciating, factory equipment that we simply aren't going to need as much of in the future. And yet there are no incentives for human capital. And this is something that I speak to constantly with CEOs about, and they're sort of baffled by the fact that they're not given these incentives to put money into the right places. So I think that there are a lot of different political groups that could line up behind this. With Gabrielle's proposal, one of the things that really struck me, and again, I think that wonderful slide about the tax base and where the most concentration is, there's going to be a battle in the future about what to tax, who to tax. There's really no question. I mean, Republicans will argue about taxes, but frankly, the majority of the country knows someone's going to have to pay more taxes on something in the future. But where will that be? Housing is an easy one to start with, because it's sort of, it's structural. You can see that wealth, you can understand that wealth, but it's very contentious. It hits the middle class. It can cause all sorts of problems. So if you start to position a tax on equity as simply a better, fairer option in a sort of a triumvirate of things that you might tax. I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
Ngaire, what do you think about, where do you draw the line on feasibility here?
Well, you know, I say beware of starting with the question of feasibility. You know, for three reasons. You know, the power of idealism. What is the role of economists, of academics, of thinkers? Surely the first role is to help elucidate what good actually looks like. And if we keep saying what's feasible, if we keep tweaking the models that we've got to say, well, actually the corporate sector won't accept this, and this government won't accept that, and we couldn't persuade this administration to do that, then we never actually put out there what good looks like. And that's part of what I loved about these two papers, is that they're having a go at saying this is what good could look like. And that's very revealing in a new way of what the problem is. The second is, in a crisis, you need new ideas. You don't need people like civil servants or, you know, who are just reheating the same stuff with a little tweak in it. And the third is a political reason, which is if you want to shift the middle option to one side or the other, you need radical options. So when I talked about joint actions between companies and governments, I wasn't saying we should avoid confrontation. I think you need very radical alternatives on the table so that you can carve out a new middle option for people. If you think about any area, regulation after the financial crisis, where it took having a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism on the table to persuade the private sector to accept collective action clauses. If you think about every, you know, if you think about, you know, women voting, you know, it took radical action to get a middle position accepted. So I sort of, there's part of me that says, first, don't start with what's feasible, but once you've got some radical ideas about what good looks like and what a new set of ideas would look like, then jump in and think about how could we imagine making those feasible.
And finally, Gabriel, this question is the sort of this is the question you're asked every day about your ideas related to this one. Of course, there are questions in our Q&A talking about how this relates to, for example, initiatives already under the way with OECD, which have been under discussion for quite a long time, and how it doesn't matter how small it is, lobbyists will still be against it. Do you feel that this has a better chance than previous initiatives?
As I said, I'm cautiously optimistic because I see what's happening with the discussions about the corporate income tax. And I'm old enough to remember when the idea of a minimum corporate income tax for multinational profits was deemed utopian and, you know, was popular among a small circle of activists and, you know, 2 or 3 academics. And, you know, 2 weeks ago, Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, said, look, this is what we want to do, and this is what we want other countries to do, and we'll get there. And so you know, things change, and I think there is a growing realization that tax competition, tax avoidance, these are not laws of nature that we have to accept. Countries choose to tolerate tax competition, tax avoidance, but they can also make other choices. And so I think we're at the very beginning of a new phase. You know, we've had 4 decades of tax competition, of race to the bottom, and I think maybe you know, there's a good chance that we're at the beginning of a few decades of something else, some race to the top, maybe some more coordination. So yeah, let's see. But I can see, you know, two things have made a big impression on me. When I started my PhD studies, I was working on bank secrecy and offshore wealth and tax evasion in Switzerland and places like that. At the time, you know, seemed to me obvious that the solution to this was to have an international exchange of bank information. And at the beginning, when I was working on this and talking about that, people said, look, it's totally utopian. It will never happen. It's a kind of pipe dream. How can you force countries like Switzerland or the Cayman Islands to exchange their data with other countries? Bank secrecy, it's their law, it's their sovereignty, that's what they've chosen. We can't do anything. And now, 10 years after, or 13 years after, there is a global automatic exchange of bank information. A new form of international coordination has emerged in just a decade. And the other thing that is making a big impression on me is the progress that is happening these days, as I said, on minimum taxation, coordinated response to the challenges that globalization has raised for the taxation of multinational profits. So let's see, but I'm optimistic.
Okay, I want to get to this question of unintended consequences in a moment, but first of all, Stefanie, there are a couple of questions looking at the differences between countries, the differences in the evolution of inequality between countries. I know that the sample for your paper was basically a sort of Europe, North America sample. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed, that was my task description, and I stuck to it. So the analysis is really about EU and then Canada, the US, and a bit of Australia. So I don't have much to say about other countries. So that's clearly very restrictive.
Yeah, but I do notice that Nicolas, his comment was a big difference in the evolution of GDP v household income between North America and Europe. I noticed that on your charts as well. What's behind that?
Yeah, so there are differences both in the sort of severity of the recession itself, and there were large drops everywhere, but overall big variations. And then there's also big differences in the evolution of household income. That was like the first figure I show, where you see this divergence. GDP drops, but household income is propped up by government intervention. And actually, the intensity of government intervention ended up on balance being actually much stronger in the US. So if we just look at the sort of total household income transmitted and propped up, was actually stronger. And it came somewhat earlier in Europe, actually, through the existing social insurance, unemployment system, etc. But it seems to have been on balance bigger in the US as of now. So we'll see where that goes. And again, a big significant thing for the longer term consequences are what actually happened to the underlying pre-government transfer income and to unemployment shocks and drop out of the labor force and things like that.
Okay. Now, let's move on to this topic of unintended consequences, because of course we don't deal in a static frame. And for both of you have mentioned that these are policies that get enacted over the medium and the long term. First of all, for you, Gabriel, there are a couple of questions here to say, well, isn't the impact of what you are proposing here going to, well, first of all, mean that companies will prefer not to list? Secondly, that there will be more debt financing, less equity financing, these two questions there. And those might overall end up being bad consequences. Do you think that they would be the consequences, and do you think they would be bad if they were?
I think some of that might happen. That some firms might choose to remain private and to issue more debt. It's possible. I don't know how big the response would be there. And I think the natural answer to that is to say big private companies should also pay the tax. And I explain how this could be implemented just by having them pay in kind with shares, just by issuing each year 0.2% of their stock in shares and transmitting those shares to the government. The government can also accumulate a notional stake, in these private businesses. Or to rephrase, there are two options. The government could either resell those shares, thus creating the market which currently is missing, or the government could just, keep accumulating notional stakes in private companies, and then when they go public, the government would cash in. No, there's no particular technical obstacle here. And same response for bonds. If you are really concerned that all of a sudden corporations are going to borrow much more and make much less profit, but pay much more interest to their bondholders, okay, fine. In that case, we can tax corporate bonds. It's very easy to do, just like for corporate equities. These corporate bonds, just like equities, are traded in very centralized and regulated markets. So we can do it.
Do you have a response to Rana's point on on whether this gives an incentive for governments to keep the process of financialization going?
That's a good question. I think it depends what we mean by financialization. So if we mean firms being listed and equity prices kind of increasing, then I think the answer is treat listed firms and private firms on an equal footing, equal basis, same tax for private firms, so that you don't distort, this margin of being listed versus remaining private.
Ngaire, you talked about how important it is to be bold at the moment. Are you worried at all about any unintended consequences on either side of this debate, whether we're talking about what we should do about inequality or what we should do about corporate taxation?
So yeah, I mean, look, my first worry would be that in certainly sitting here in the UK, there is still a lively debate in government about how to build back after the crisis. And there is an austerity playbook, which many officials know very well because they've used it after financial crises. And I think the biggest risk is that after an initial moment of kind of COVID solidarity, governments around the world that should be taking a new approach will simply cling to the austerity playbook because it's the one they know best, and because they have so little experience and so little capability to do the kinds of investments that are going to be needed to build back better. So if you're asking about what the risk is, to me, that's the biggest risk. But I think, and with that is the risk that there just aren't enough ideas on the table. There aren't enough ideas that are radical enough to help actually show. And I'm sitting here speaking to you from Oxford, and at the end of the Second World War, Beveridge and other great thinkers sat in colleges of Oxford thinking about what a completely transformed British economy would look like. And British debt was 250% of GDP. And they still came up with an extraordinary project of a fully free national health service, of an education of value for every child in Britain, and decent housing. And to do that in a country destroyed by war with 250% debt to GDP, that's bold. So I guess there's a part of me that says we should all be trying to be that bold now, because if we don't, because of where I started, which might have seemed odd to people to start with the security threat, but my point is that the security threat has come about because of where our economy has gotten to, and because it's not people in poverty, it's people who have lost a sense that they are entitled, if they work hard, to ensure better lives for their children. And they're watching their kids get smaller houses, worse education, and worse jobs. And they're mad and they're angry, and they're turning on the democratic institutions, which our market economics have been nested into. And then our competitors have a different system. Our strategic competitors do not have those same rules. And it just, so to me, the risk is that, and certainly within academia and within disciplines, we're all trained to make very small incremental steps. And so my plea to economists and political economists is, this is a time, as many are, and certainly look at these two in front of us, this is the time to break out and to look to history, to look to other disciplines, to look boldly and radically about what could be done.
Rana, you're nodding in agreement on that. Is this something you agree with?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, just I'm struck by what both speakers talked about in terms of the pendulum shift. I mean, you know, Gabrielle making this point that things that were being discussed even 5 years ago as completely out of the ballpark are now front and center, you know, and I think in the US, actually, that I said this earlier, but I think that there's not yet widespread understanding that this administration, even though it's being run by someone that has been considered, you know, little left of center, but not wildly left of center, the agenda is actually pretty radical, you know, to restructure the economy in all these ways that this administration is trying to do, and to de-silo it. And I think that that's really important too. There's now a kind of a de-siloing of discussions of corporate governance, how the financial markets work, how the labor markets work, national security. I mean, you know, it's quite fascinating. I have some of my most interesting conversations about economic and racial justice with people in the Defense Department, because they actually see this as an important issue, because insecurity breeds populism, which breeds conflict. And those conversations are exactly what we need to be having.
Stefanie, another question on this. What does your paper find out about intergenerational inequality and the effect on intergenerational inequality of the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like the part that's closest to it is the part on education, where we can very much see that the impact has been incredibly different for children from different backgrounds, as I outlined relatively briefly in the talk, and then in much more detail in the paper. And that has the potential to be, a generational gap that is there unless much more is done. And it's not that, again, it's not something that wasn't the case before. There were already, even in Europe, that spends so much on public education. Even there's very large gaps for schools in different areas and children from different backgrounds. So that was already there, and now it's bound to be much more amplified. And the reason it's so worrying is because, economists, psychologists, education experts have shown very convincingly how big the gaps can be from very little differences at young ages. And so it's something that's particularly urgent to address. Then, on a less direct COVID thing, but more on the thinking about the revenues and the fairness going forward, that's where the proposal about inheritance, estate, and gift taxes come in. In the end, these are the taxes that sort of a bit mechanically try to cut the link between generational wealth, not entirely by any means, but try to dampen it. And so there, I feel like moving to a system that is much more efficient and that ultimately will be perceived as much more fair by people is very important.
It will be remarkable if inheritance tax comes up for serious discussion, because that has been a real political no-go area for a long time. I'd like to ask the rest of you about this as well. The intergenerational impacts of what we might do in the next few years and what is happening now, and the sort of world that we are going to bequeath to the next generation who aren't in this seminar. So Ngaire, would you like to go first?
Well, I think, Stefanie's paper underlying the numbers in her paper is a story of, as everybody knows, of the COVID-19 lockdown massively accelerating, the divide, and therefore blighting a next generation's opportunities, because they've missed out on so much in terms of education, in terms of socialization. It's not just missing being in school, but for kids from the 25% of deprived households in Britain, where school is the only safe place they can be, this has been a devastating year. So we were already in a really bad place before the pandemic in relation to this group. I think in the United States, some 81% of households had seen their household revenue decline or stagnate in the decade and a half before the pandemic arose, and in Britain it was 72%. That's 3/4 of the population of both countries not really having a stake in believing that the system's working for them. So we shouldn't be surprised that most of them decided actually the system doesn't work for them, and they'd rather go to a more radical alternative. So I think the generational, that's why I think that this cradle to grave message and this echo of a Britain coming out of the war is actually really relevant, because there is just such a large swathe of the population that does not have, that has no springboard under them to bounce into the economy. And yet our economy is set up assuming that they have to have one.
Rana, for you.
Yeah, thinking about intergenerational differences, I think one of the biggest political stories in America in the next, couple of decades is going to be boomers versus millennials. And if you look already, boomers are holding the vast majority of wealth in the country, a lot of it in stock and housing. You've got the millennial generation and the generations below coming out into depressed job markets that, lots of research to show if you come out during a depressed job market, you never regain that income. Huge $2 trillion debt bubble. Not just the students really hurting from that, but many of the universities now too. We're probably going to have a collapse, not so much in the premier universities, but certainly already community college system is beleaguered. A lot of the second tier universities are probably going to go under because of debt issues. So you've got this divide, and I worry a lot actually that that's going to result in a kind of a battle for this shrinking pie between two groups of people over things that are both legitimate, aid for students, better care for the elderly. And so I think thinking about how to, it's sort of a no-brainer. It's hard to believe that we are even debating it at this stage, but thinking about ways to tax the giant multinational companies, the largest of which have benefited, not to repeat or channel Mariana Mazzucato, but have benefited wildly from the public commons and investment, federal investment into R&D in the 60s and 70s. To recapture some of that wealth is really, I think, the only way to not have that intergenerational conflict, become a really negative dynamic politically.
And Gabriel, I'm going to also roll into the question about intergenerational impacts. Claudio's comment here about whether there should be a higher tax rate on companies, firms in the non-renewable sector as well, whether that would be practical. What do you think of that idea, and also the intergenerational impacts of the sort of policies that we are pursuing at the moment?
Yeah, I know. I think that this is a great question. I think, look, we need to use. We all agree with that. The tax system to, reduce carbon emissions, and the carbon tax is a critical tool to prevent climate change. I'm not saying it's the only one. But it's obviously important, and the general thinking of economists, which I think in that instance is actually correct, is you want to change incentives to emit carbon across the board. So you want the most comprehensive carbon tax possible. This raises complicated, distributional questions, and so you have to do this very carefully with these distributional concerns in mind. But I'm of the view that when it comes to the environment, pollution, the climate, you want a very comprehensive, high, rising carbon tax rather than targeting just some sources of emissions or some corporations. On the intergenerational aspect, I would just want to add one thing to the discussion, which is sometimes it's important to keep in mind that there is also a great deal of heterogeneity within generations. And so in fact, when you look at wealth inequality, there is as much wealth inequality within each age group, within each cohort, broadly speaking, than in the entire population. So to put it simply, you have millennials who are billionaires, and you have millennials who have zero wealth. And in each generation, in each age cohort, there is a great deal of wealth concentration. So just to say that this remains a key element, a key component of inequality.
Okay, we're in our last few minutes now, so there's time for one more question. It's got to be short answers to this question, please, but I really do have to pose it. It's the one that Harold Ulick put up, which is, could it be the idea that countries across the world will, in the future, be in happy harmony, working together everywhere, impose the same corporate taxes, and generally work for world peace and blissful happiness everywhere, possibly be a tiny bit utopian? So I'm going to ask our two commenters first, and then our two presenters to give me a quick answer to that one. First of all, so Rana, do you want to kick that one off?
Nice softball, Tim.
I have to ask it.
No, and yes. I mean, no, I don't think we're resetting to the mid-1990s, okay? Not that everything was peaceful and wonderful then, but we were talking about it as though it was. We're not resetting. I think that we're in a time period where not only do we have to move away from neoliberal laissez-faire capitalism as a whole, I think that we need to just think more about place. We need to think more about remooring economic globalization that has just run so far ahead of national politics. And yet finding ways to do that don't put us back in the 1930s, And I really do believe, I'm kind of an optimist in this sense. I think that there is a happy medium between the mid-1990s and the 1930s. And I think that creating ways for the largest multinational companies to pay their fair share of the burden and to also enrich the public commons are certainly two ways to get there.
Ngaire? You're muted, Ngaire.
Sorry, it was very short. Peaceful bliss. No, look, I think seriously, we need cooperation on these issues. We've got to go back in time. We can't think about the world since 1990 with a comfortable hegemony by a small group of countries who like to talk in terms of values. We have to go back in time to learn lessons from the Cold War, when enemies were able to cooperate on things like arms control, zones of neutrality, to the concert of Europe, where you had ferocious strategic competitors nevertheless cooperating on certain things where cooperation was required. That is going to be absolutely vital. To me, one of the big questions that lies behind this debate, puzzling me, to Gabriel and Stefanie, is about whether we should be trying more to set a new culture and narrative, or new rules and incentives, and whether the one will crowd the other out. Because I was just thinking, things like the responsible tax principles or impact reporting, these are things that are creating a new narrative for companies, which says we're proud of how much tax we pay. And if we go all out to shape new rules, will we crowd out that instinct to try to actually show themselves to be good citizens? I'm not sure if that fits your question, Tim, but I'll stop there.
Okay, that's fine. Gabriel, you give me an answer, and then we'll finish off with Stefanie. Gabriel first.
I would say, look, the international exchange of bank information was deemed utopian 10 years ago. Country by country minimum taxation was deemed utopian 3 years ago. The progressive income tax was deemed utopian, a century ago. A 40 hours work week, abolishing child labor, all of that was deemed utopian. And I think as scholars and participants in the public sphere, we should first and foremost try to say what we think is good and what we think should be the goal, and then to explain how we can get there, rather than just start by saying, look, all of this is utopian and let's just not do anything.
You've been asked that question before. Stefanie, you finish us off.
It's hard to add anything relative to what was already said, but I very much feel like there's a lot of value in giving a new narrative and what is the final goal? What are we trying to achieve? And then talk about the constraints. And I feel like many of the proposals that are made are very much with constraints in mind. I already answered that question before. So it is already a selected set of policies that are both moving towards a better world, but also have feasibility in mind.
Okay. Well, thank you, all four of you. We are out of time. Thank you for all of you that have come along today and asked so many questions. About a third of which we got through. Maybe we got through about a half of them. So thanks ever so much for all the questions. And we hope that even if you didn't get your exact question answered, then we got to the spirit of it. We certainly got to a lot of material. In fact, if we'd have gone into every answer that we got in some detail, then we'd have had about 5 or 6 seminars. So there's plenty of material here for the future. We'll be coming in this direction again. Meanwhile, if you want to pick up the presentations, go to economic-policy.org. You will find them there and you can download them. A lot of you are asking about that. Just remains for me to say thank you to Stefanie, Gabriel, Ngaire, and Rana for being such great panelists today. And thank you to all of you for watching from me, Tim Phillips, at the CPR, from everyone at Economic Policy. We will see you again soon. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.